Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. On each of the next 4 evenings, 2 local rabbis will join us for a discussion with Abi about 4 questions critical to this moment. Abi will introduce the question and the rabbis each evening, and we will then take questions from the audience. I get to introduce Abi tonight. You know and you love her as a frequent moderator at many of the city Jewish institutions, as the author of best-selling books, and an active member of the community. I can tell you that in the past 2 years, I've got to know her on a personal level. She is extremely committed to sharing Jewish knowledge and values, encouraging the community to get together. You know, I'm always recalled that she's the former president of Central Synagogue, and yet she works so closely with us. The Yesod program has a lot to do with Abi and her work and getting her commitment and getting all the faculty. So thank you, Abi, for both her commitment to the community and for making my job much, much easier. Please welcome to the stage Abi Pogrebin.
Thank you.
Oh, hi.
Thank you, guys.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. One of the joys of being asked to collaborate with the impresario Gadi Levi on events like these is seeing the pure zeal that he truly feels about expanding and deepening the Jewish conversation, especially in the midst of the cacophony of opinions and emotions right now in our community. We need to keep talking to each other. And the next 4 evenings are an opportunity to hear from some of our leading thinkers on a few of the questions that we are all wrestling with. Each night, just so you understand the structure, we'll begin with a brief 10 to 15-minute teaching from each panelist, because as you all know, every Jewish dialogue has to start with text and learning. Then I will interrogate our speakers based on what I just heard, and not to make this all about me, but I want to make clear that I've not seen their remarks in advance, so I'll be responding just as you are in real time. Just by way of explanation, these 4 evenings are a capstone to a year-long program for those who were not part of it, called Yesod, meaning foundations, which Gadi Levi conceived with Rabbi Joshua Davidson years ago, and which finally came to fruition this year. 33 Tuesdays of incredible learning, Judaism soup to nuts, from some of our greatest teachers. When Gadi and Rabbi Davidson asked me and Rabbi David Wolpe to design the curriculum, we never anticipated that everyone on our wish list would say yes, nor did we expect that 450 students would sign up, both in person and online. Nor did we obviously conceive that this program would be happening with the backdrop of October 7th and its aftermath. Suffice it to say, it has been a very powerful year. And to anyone out there who might be feeling some FOMO, the good news is that next year is an entirely new standalone introduction to the Hagim, the holidays, just 9 sessions, not 33, with different rabbis and music and food. We go a different place for every holiday, and there's still time to sign up. And now I'm so honored to introduce our esteemed speakers tonight. Rabbi Joshua M. Davidson is the Peter and Mary Calico Senior Rabbinic Chair at Temple Emanu-El, where you are. He has served on several boards for human rights, peace, and justice, as well as having numerous articles in many publications you read. Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz is the Senior Rabbi of Congregation Kehilath Jeshurun, otherwise known as KJ, in the neighborhood. He currently serves on the Board of Directors of the UJA Federation of New York. He has also written for many publications, including a regular column for the Canadian Jewish News for many years, and he has a blog called The Happiness Warrior. Welcome, Josh and Chaim. Sorry I talked so long, but you're up first, Rabbi Davidson, and we are attentive.
Thank you, Abby. And I want to echo Gadi's thanks to you for your brilliant leadership and visioning of this entire year. And we're so fortunate to have you as part of everything that takes place at the Streicker Cultural Center. And to Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, my beloved colleague, I'm very much looking forward to spending this evening with you too. So when I was assigned to tonight's question, is pluralism a Jewish value, I became a bit nervous. I said to myself, gosh, I sure hope so, because if it's not, I have some serious thinking to do about my religious identity. Fortunately, I quickly recalled sufficient text to confirm in my own mind that pluralism is indeed a Jewish value, and I'll present two of those texts. The first is from the Shulchan Aruch, literally the set table, a legal code compiled in the 16th century by Rabbi Joseph Caro. Caro, of Spanish descent, wrote from a Sephardic legal point of view. But then Rabbi Moses Isserles, known as the Rima, a renowned 16th century Polish scholar, wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, he appropriately called Hamapa, the tablecloth. And the two texts were published together, creating an authoritative code that contained both the Sephardic and Ashkenazic halachic perspectives. And this text that we'll look at to begin with comes from a section of the Shulchan Aruch dealing with kashrut, tzedakah, conversion, and other ritual matters. The section is called Yoreh Deah, which literally means it gives instruction or understanding. Who has a mezuzah on their doorpost? Okay, good. How do you, and if you don't have one, this is not I'm not judging. How do you, when you hang the mezuzah, how do you hang it? Sephardic. Oh, you looked at the text. Okay, so Jane, you said you hang it like that. You hang it at an angle. Does anybody know why we hang it at an angle? Oh, because you can't get it on the skinny doorpost. Oh, well, that may be a practical answer. But the real answer actually comes from the text that we're going to look at. Okay, so I'll read the first one. The first text, again, comes from Shulchan Aruch, and I'll read it slowly. The mezuzah should be erect lengthwise on the length of the doorpost of the doorway. Rima, Rabbi Moses Isserles, adds, and that is how they practice. But there are those who say that the mezuzah is invalid erect, rather it needs to be inclined towards the width of the doorpost of the doorway, that is to say, horizontally. And those who are scrupulous fulfill both opinions and place the mezuzah at an incline, at a diagonal. And this is how it is proper to practice. And this is how we practice in these places. And one should intend that the top of the mezuzah, where the word Shema is, should be towards the inside of the house, and the last line should be facing outside.
That was really dramatic reading. Honestly, Josh, that was wonderful.
Or I'm just getting warmed up. All right, so let me unpack this for you a little bit. Has anybody been to Israel? Okay, what do you call those mounds of earth that are yet to be tells, right? And where is the newest part of civilization? On the top, on the bottom, where? On the top, okay, right. So if you want to discover the older stuff, you have to dig down from the top. Okay. Now, the brilliant author and early Zionist activist, Chaim Nachman Bialik, explained that halakha is kind of the same. Every halakha represents the top layer, the final outcome of a rich and sometimes very fierce rabbinic debate. And the text we just looked at is no different. Now, I first encountered the text I shared with you in a wonderful essay by the late Rabbi Harold Schulweis titled Pluralism as the Will of God. Their names aren't included, but what I read is the ruling that emerged out of a dispute between the 11th century French commentator Rashi and his own grandson, Rabbeinu Tam. And if you ever wondered why we hang a mezuzah at an angle, it's because of their argument. Now, each apparently based his claim on a verse from the first two paragraphs of the Shema, which the mezuzah contains. Rashi insisted hang it vertically because Shema says, when you rise up, uvkumecha. Rabbeinu Tam countered, hang it horizontally, for Shema says, when you lie down. And their disciples, wanting to respect both opinions, agreed to a compromise. Hang it at an angle. Now, not only does this text from the Shulchan Aruch provide a great example of a pluralistic approach to a legal dispute, it also offers a wonderful metaphor for how we might address ideological conflict in our own lives. Shalom bayit, peace in the home or community, requires each of us to humble ourselves a little bit, to bend just enough like a slanted mezuzah to be able to see other people's perspectives. When we construct our worldview around our own moral certainty, the others in our lives will either be right or wrong, and mostly wrong. But when we learn to see more than our own way, we begin to perceive nuance we hadn't before. We become less judgmental and more compassionate. We know when to stand firm, but also when we can bend. And we begin to understand that each of us occupies a small place in a much larger universe of people and concerns, that we can't see every perspective, and that we have to make room for the possibility, as the late Howard Baker famously said, that the other fellow may be right. So Jewish texts are filled with debate, and minority opinions are often recorded. The best known disagreements were between the house or disciples of Hillel and those of Shammai, two scholars of the 1st century BCE. One would declare an item to be pure or kosher, an act to be permitted, and the other often would counter impure, not kosher, not allowed. And the solution wasn't always as simple as tilting the mezuzah. So how then was the community to make sense of disparity, even conflict, among rabbinic authorities? In the next passage from the Tosefta, a companion to the Mishnah with material not included in the Mishnah, the late 1st, early 2nd century Palestinian rabbi Elazar ben Azariah gives his answer, of which his contemporary Rabbi Yehoshua seems to approve. Now I'll read it since you don't all have it. And he, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, also expounded, perhaps it will arise in one's mind that since Beit Shammai declares impure and Beit Hillel declares pure, so-and-so prohibits and so-and-so permits, why should I henceforth study Torah? So what's Elazar's concern? What will people do if they see all these conflicting opinions? They won't study. They'll just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, this is so confusing, why even bother? Here's his answer. Scripture teaches words, the words, these are the words. That's a passage from Exodus 19:6-7. All of these words were given by one shepherd. That's a passage from Ecclesiastes, which says the sayings of the wise were all given by one shepherd. One God created them, one benefactor gave them, the master of all deeds, blessed be God, said them. So make for your heart chambers within chambers, and bring into it the words of Beit Shammai and the words of Beit Hillel. Bring in the words of those who declare impure and the words of those who declare pure. After hearing what had been expounded in the house of study, Rabbi Yehoshua said, there is no generation that can be considered orphaned if Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah dwells in its midst. Just a lovely statement about how embracing Elazar ben Azariah was. There was room for everybody. No one would be alone. Okay, so again, Elazar's concern is that confusion might lead people just to kind of throw up their hands and give up on Jewish practice altogether. And so he reminds us that the words of one authority, like the words of another authority, even if they're in opposition, are nonetheless the words of one shepherd. So we should figure out how to make room for them within our hearts and our minds. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And in a recent essay on the shortage of non-Orthodox rabbis, actually, he offered his own takes on this passage from Tosefta. So follow with me. It begins a person. Okay. A person who is confused by the debates between the house of Hillel and Shammai, but recognizes that their different traditions are given by the same God, should make for themselves a heart of many rooms, to internalize even these conflicting ideas as part of the complexity of revelation. This was an idea ahead of its time. In texts like these, Revelation exposes a huge chasm between God's infinite character and our human limitations, suggesting that each of us can access only small pieces of the divine word. This is a theological argument for epistemological humility, which in turn engenders a kind of pluralism, the kind that makes us recognize that no individual or group of individuals has unique access to the vastness or accuracy of Torah, that we are each obligated to value our individual contributions to the continuation of Torah, and that we are dependent on one another to try to capture the complex tapestry of wisdom that God has bequeathed to this world. Okay, so an openness to differences of opinion and philosophy is necessary to witness the tapestry Kurtzer refers to. And here, I think Dr. Kurtzer offers a really beautiful gloss on the Tosefta. The way I understand him, he says, knowledge requires humility, the ability to recognize we don't have the vision to see every point of view. Or as the Mishnah asks, Ezehu Hacham, who is wise? Halomed Mikol Adam, the one who is willing to learn from other people. And that requires making space for other perspectives. Now, lest you think that these passages can be employed to validate any point of view, they can't be. The Jewish textual tradition has enough thou shalt nots to set boundaries on human behavior, human belief, and human practice. But within those boundaries, clearly it affords great opportunity for plurality of philosophy and opinion. I'm going to conclude my remarks by transporting this discussion out of the realm of halakha into the realm of political, communal, and even family dynamics, because those concerns, day in and day out, probably weigh most heavily upon us. So often, conflicting arguments come at us from opposite directions, and we don't know which is right, which we should listen to. Often we hear truths in each, and we can almost feel a rending inside us. And that's why the image of the heart of many chambers is both beautiful and so poignant, because sometimes ideas feel so much in conflict that they each require their own separate space. And here we could be talking about the war in Gaza, or about conflicts between our children or our parents, whom we love and want to keep in our hearts, though sometimes they just can't live in close quarters there. And so we need to construct multiple rooms within us to be able to hold them all. It's not easy living with values or people in conflict, but as the text admonishes us, we're not allowed to give up. A pluralistic approach to the world is actually required of us. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Davidson. You are up, Rabbi Steinmetz.
It's really such an honor to be here with two exceptional Jewish leaders in Josh and Abby, and not just two exceptional Jewish leaders, but two wonderful human beings, which I think is a lot more important, I would imagine. And it's an honor to be here and to join you. I chose texts that are very different. And actually, they're very different from each other, and they're also very different from Rabbi Davidson's texts. And the reason why is because I think we need to sort of enlarge our perspective before we talk about pluralism, which is something that's so easy to grasp a hold of. For American Jews, particularly more liberal American Jews, to talk about how we need to make room for each other, it's very easy. But that's not always the tenor of what Judaism is trying to convey. And here I'm sharing with you a midrash that actually is very well known. It's often associated with a passage in the Haggadah, when in the Haggadah of Passover we say that initially our forefathers were worshipers of idols. And we quote a verse from the end of Sefer Yehoshua, from the book of Joshua, where Joshua says just the same. And this idea that maybe Abraham, and actually that's what the book of Joshua says, Abraham's father, Terach, was an idol worshiper. This idea excites the imagination of the Midrash. And here comes a text in which Abraham, is literally the first iconoclast. He's the first one to come and smash idols. And this text is so profoundly influential, not just in Judaism. It actually passes from the Midrash through Muhammad into the Quran. It is included in the Quran. And so listen to the text, and the text will say that there are truths, and that is what Abraham stood for. And Abraham said, I am a monotheist, and I am standing against my own father's tradition. And I am saying we need to see things differently. So the text goes, and I don't know if I'll read it, why not? I cut it at halfway. If you want to read the rest of it, please do so. But it says like this: Haran died in the presence of Terach, his father, in the land of his birth, in the Ur of the Chaldeans. Haran died during the lifetime of Terach, his father. That actually is not related to what we're about to read. Rav Hiya, the grandson of Rav Ada of Yafo, said, Terach was an idol worshiper and a seller of idols. One time, he went away to some place and he installed Abraham as salesman in his stead. So here, the father is bringing the son into the family business. Abraham is being brought into the family business of pagan sales. He is the one who's supposed to sell idols. And a person came into seeking to buy an idol. Abraham would say to him, how old are you? He would say to him, 50 or 60 years old. Not the same person, different people would say 50 and 60. He would say to him, woe to this man who is 60 years old and seeks to prostrate himself before something that is one day old. Meaning you're 60 years old and you're taking an idol that we just pulled out of the factory? That's irrational. And that, I think, is really the beginning of this, is that the polemic here is that idol worship is irrational. But then comes the next text. And here, it's going to say that idol worship is even hypocritical. But the key here is what happens. So he would be ashamed and leave. One time, a certain woman came, carrying a dish of fine flour in her hand. She said to Abraham, to him, here, offer it before them. Offer it before the idols. He arose, took a club in his hand, shattered all the idols, and placed the club in the hand of the largest among them. So now Abraham destroys his father's idol shop, with the exception of the largest idol, whom he is going to implicate in the crime. When his father came, he said to Abraham, who did this to them? He said to him, I will not lie to you. A certain woman came, carrying a dish of fine flour in her hand. She said to me, here, offer it before them. I offered it before them. This idol said, I shall eat first, and another said, I shall eat first. The big idol who was standing among them got up and took the club and shattered them. So he goes to his father and he says, I've got a story. This is what happened. How did all the small idols get smashed? It was the biggest idol who did it, because they were all fighting over who is going to eat this fine offering before them. And he, Terach, meaning Abraham's father, said to him, what, are you mocking me? Are they sentient at all? To which Abraham says to his father, do your ears not hear what your mouth is saying? So the second argument is not just irrationality, but even hypocrisy. The first one is irrational. How are you, a 50 or 60-year-old, bowing to an idol that we just pulled out of the factory? The second one is that it's actually hypocritical. He turns to his father and says the largest idol is smashing the smaller idols, And his father says, you know that's impossible. And so Abraham says, are you listening to what you say? Meaning it's hypocritical. Now, putting aside the specific polemic, what I want to talk about here is the fact that the idols are getting smashed. And that is something that is dramatic. It's his father's idols. And yet the demands of faith and the demands of truth demand dramatic action. And when we talk about pluralism, what needs to be counterbalanced with is an understanding that I believe all of us have limits. And not only that, all of us have beliefs. And had Abraham decided, idol worship might be okay for my dad, it's not so good for me, his career might have been very different. So I want to start with that text. And now I want to take you to another text. So if we had the first text, you know, you might pigeonhole me. Okay, this is an Orthodox rabbi. And, you know, it's one way, you know, my way or the highway. But then there's another text that kind of forces a very different perspective. And we'll get back in the conversation to Rabbi Davidson's text. But here I want to take another text which also represents Abraham's values, that all of a sudden force you to recalculate everything you might think. Because the first text says, well, look, if you're a true believer, then this is your way. And that may end up dividing you from other people. Now comes another text. And this text has to do with the moment in the Bible. And this is a text in the Talmud Bavli in Shabbat, page 127a. And this is a moment when Abraham is standing outside his tent, and what he doesn't know it then, but angels appear to him. And the text in the Bible is a little strange, because it says, and God appeared to Abraham, and then Abraham says, my master, please don't leave, which is kind of strange. And then he runs and gets the guests. And so it's kind of the chronology doesn't seem to work, because is he speaking to God? But then the guests come, and who's he saying, don't leave me? Who exactly is he speaking to? So the Talmud has a really interesting way of reconciling this. The Talmud says, and I'll explain it before I read it, the Talmud says that actually Abraham was speaking to God, and he sees guests outside of his tent, and he turns to God and he says, do you mind waiting? I have some guests to bring in. And here's the Talmud. The Talmud says, Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said on a related note, hospitality toward guests is greater than receiving the divine presence. And here I'll just read the last lines. Abraham requested that God, the divine presence, wait for him while he tended to his guests appropriately. Now, it's a beautiful text, but then you have to dig a little deeper and say to yourself, what on earth does this text mean? Imagine God's on the phone and you get call waiting. Do you pick up call waiting? Not really. But this is where the Talmud says, no, you run out and you get the guests. And I thought about this for a long time, and then it hit me. You know what this text is saying? It's not about call waiting. It's about partners who have a store. And God and Abraham are partners. And they're on the phone. And a customer comes in. So then you turn to God, even though he's God, on the phone, and you say, sorry, we have a customer. I have to take care of them. And this is a text that perhaps you could put together with the concepts of tikkun olam, of recognizing that man is God's partner in making the world the best that it is. But it's also more than that. It's recognizing that every human being deserves respect because of the biblical teaching that man is created in the image of God. And it is here where I'm going to leave you with a question rather than an answer, is how do you sort of pull these two visions together? One which is a vision of God, which forces you to say, I'm not going to accept idols. And another is a vision of God, which forces you to say, I need to treat every human being with respect because that's what God wants me to do. And how do you pull the two together? And that's the riddle that I'm going to leave you with. And I think from here we can continue the conversation.
Wonderful. I just want to follow up, because it's fresh in our mind, with smashing idols. These are things that are coming to me from both of your teachings. I feel like there's a lot of idols right now, and when I think about idols, I think about certainties. People are very sure of things right now, and I know you both are a little loath into getting into specifics, whether it's American politics or what's happening in Israel, but in terms of what's happening in our community, it's harder, I think, than ever to listen the way all of these texts are kind of encouraging us to actually have a certain patience or capacity for another way of looking at it. And I guess what I'm asking is, because you mentioned the orthodoxy, and as an Orthodox rabbi, when is it like a bridge too far? You know, when is someone's certainties actually honorable, and one has to respect them even if they're intolerant in a certain way? And when is it kind of on us, or a tradition saying no matter how sure you are, or no matter how entrenched you are in what you believe, you actually have to invite that guest in and open yourself up to something that's uncomfortable?
Well, I think that part of it, that's a very interesting question. And it's a question that I think the Orthodox community struggles with enormously. In other words, how do we make, if we are, so to speak, rather certain in our views, how do we make room? So, we'll get to pluralism later, but I think part of it is that there has to be a sense of consciousness.
Wait, why pluralism later? Why isn't that a pluralism
Okay, so
question?
we can talk about pluralism now, that's fine. I wanted to first talk about something else.
Okay.
I wanted to talk first about orthodoxy in the modern period, meaning when you realize that you are a minority, when you realize that your story isn't being heard by everyone, and that you realize that your truth claims are not obvious. They're far from obvious. And part of what's inherited by orthodoxy is that there's this belief that, we're correct and the heretic needs to be pushed out of the community. Now, when you define, when you decide that nobody else is okay and you're 5 or 10% of the community, that's a completely different situation. And I think about one of the great ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Israel, Rabbi Avram Yeshaya Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, who is the one who built basically, he built the Jewish community of Bnei Brak in many ways, which is an ultra-Orthodox community. But in his own writings, he says, we don't live at a time of prophecy. So that if someone is a heretic by the Talmudic definition, he says, now we don't castigate them. We need to bring them back by chains of love. So, your question could be answered in multiple different ways. I'm going to throw out this point. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of other points as the evening goes. But orthodoxy has had to adapt to modernity. And in many ways, orthodoxy has to recognize that our self-image is not the image that the rest of the world sees it as. And that's a reality check that has to be taken in.
And I'm going to own that I sort of conflated religious orthodoxy, like Jewish, essentially a denomination. I'm also touching on the certainties that many of us are feeling now, let's say in terms of our Zionism, right? So the heretic is the Jew who's questioning Israel at all. And that's part of what I think, particularly in our own families or in our own social groups or whatever we see in terms of our professional colleagues, just that feels like heresy to many of us, to question the project at all. And having these texts kind of push us to be more patient with that, more open to open our tent to that, is particularly difficult right now. So I guess I just want, before I go to Josh, for you to address kind of the rubric, particularly of the Abraham and the tent story.
Well, I think the Abraham and the tent story is perfectly instructive for our time. We overvalue the political. And when it comes to relationships, even if, and again, I'm trying to, well, let's say someone has the exact opposite view on Zionism than I do. They have the exact opposite view on Israel than I do. We don't have to talk about Israel. And I don't see them per se as my enemy, because I know where the enemy is, and it's Hamas, and it's Iran, and it's Hezbollah. And to turn to Jews who don't necessarily follow my point of view and see them as an enemy is an enormous mistake. And I would add, going back to what the Chazon Ish said, is that we have to think about, okay, we're angry at the, first of all, let's say it's whoever it is, it's your brother-in-law, it's always the brother-in-law. So your brother-in-law has the wrong point of view, and it infuriates you. First of all, it's a lot about you. That's number one. Number two, you have to think not just about 10 minutes or 10 months, but about 10 years. And you need to draw people in with those chains of love. And if you can't speak to them civilly, they might be lost to the Jewish community. I'm thinking of, there was a Chabad rabbi in the University of Colorado in Denver who went to the encampment and brought a pair of tefillin and got the men, that's how Chabad works, they got the men, the Jewish men in the encampment to put on tefillin. And that's a beautiful thing. We need to say, let's put everything else aside, because for the long-term health of our community, let's look at where it's going to be 10 years from now. Someone who is very anti-Zionist today might have a change of heart. And particularly someone who's young and anti-Zionist has a very good chance of having a change of heart, but not if we write them off and excommunicate them.
Josh, do you want to respond to that before I go to the mezuzah? Because I'm ready to do that, but.
I think it's a very beautiful statement. I think, what I would say, and I'm in agreement with Chaim, is that at some point we've got to make a choice. What's more important? Keeping people in our lives or proving ourselves right? And when it comes to family, that choice may be one way. It can be, perhaps, that when it comes to communal institutions, the choice may go another way. Ultimately, pluralism isn't about just being nice to other people because you think that's the right thing to do. Pluralism is about trying to make space within a community for a diversity of opinion to hold that community together. But communities are allowed to have agendas and points of view. I would argue the Jewish community's most important agenda is Jewish continuity. But what is the Judaism that we want to continue? And it could be that there are certain ideals that are not part of the Judaism that we want to continue through the generations, at which point the Jewish community has a right to say, well, this actually is not part of Judaism as we want it to be, and therefore if you choose to practice or believe in that way, maybe there should be another community for you. Communities have the right to make those determinations. but we might make decisions very differently when it comes to our family, because our family, we don't want to kick somebody out in quite the same way.
So Josh, on that, because you've just led me right to it, the mezuzah text was so powerful to me, not just because it was this compromise, but it was also a sense of like, what kind of house do I want? What kind of home is this? And it's a challenge, I think, to me personally, or to anyone I see who's struggling in their families right now with very different opinions of how we're going to navigate these fissures. And so I would just love you to kind of, again, say, like, what does that symbol become? And then the other piece of it is that the Shema is first, and that means listen, hear. And many of us are just, when we're listening, it's kind of like we're waiting till you're done so I can tell you why you're wrong. You know, I feel like I'm going to hear you out, and then let me give you all my talking points, because you're actually going to be convinced by them. Realizing that, of course, that never works. But the Shema piece of it, and the fact that that's at the top.
Yeah, that's very good.
Thank you.
It takes a brilliant author to catch that piece. So I was with a colleague a couple of days ago, a Reform colleague, whose child graduated an Ivy League institution a few days before that. The Ivy League institutions, as you know, have had a troubled year, many of them. And her child was actually one of those who was in the encampments. She and her husband and her parents, who were coming to the graduation, all felt, very differently. They were more Zionist, as I think probably the three of us sitting up here are, and so they were pretty nervous about this graduation weekend, because they were all going to go out to dinner, and she had a conversation with her son, and he said, don't worry, I'm not gonna say anything that sets off any fights. And she had a conversation with the parents, and they said, don't worry, we're here to celebrate him. We're not gonna be judging. So this sometimes is what we need to do. We just need to live with the fact that people have disagreements, and not, as you pointed out, Abby, try to convince them that we're right, because you don't strengthen relationships by trying to score points off of one another. We know that. And that's where the heart of many chambers, I think, is such a beautiful image, because we have to make space for people within our hearts, within our homes, and sometimes we have to keep certain parts of ourselves separate in order to achieve that shalom bayit.
And before we leave the heart of many chambers, which also I think is just a beautiful idea, when so many people right now feel like their hearts are broken and are really feeling shut down in many ways from these pluralistic ideals, it's kind of like, you know what, I will listen after the worst is over. I will listen when people stop trying to kill us. There is almost like I am entitled now to close those chambers a little bit. How do you respond to that feeling of not being as expansive?
You're not talking about inside one's home. You're talking about inside the community. Yeah, look, so can I just share, did you all study Buber yet over the course of the year? Okay, so I just want to share a little bit of Buber. So Buber believes the most profound relationships are the I-thou relationships, where you truly open yourself up to meeting the other person. But what Buber said about those meetings is that they can never become mergings. You can never give up so much of yourself that you submerge yourself into somebody else. You can't sacrifice the things that are truly core to your identity and your values. Otherwise, you lose your sense of self. And that's not an I-thou relationship, and it's not healthy at all. And so from that, I do learn that there are certain times when we are entitled to draw lines. And we can say, this is what we stand for. What you're talking about, that is not an ideal that we as an institution accept. Not going to throw you out, but just know that's not the line that we take, and we take a line, we believe, for very, very good reasons, for the survival of our people.
Chaim, can I ask you about the red lines in terms of the ideals or the sort of orientation to pluralism? Where do you feel like you would counsel us that it's okay to say, my pluralism stops here?
It's hard. I'm sort of thinking of what sort of examples I would use. I think that if it's hurtful for us to hear the other person, again, I don't see any of these conversations as changing the course of the universe, but there are times where hearing the other person may even be hurtful, where you kind of feel that what they're spewing is just propaganda, like they're just giving you a set of talking points. And I've done it myself. I've said, like, happy to talk to you about anything except for Israel. I mean, I love hearing the other side, fascinatingly enough. As much as I'm very strong in my own view, I'm fascinated by it. I'm trying to understand what is it that they're thinking. But
you really mean that?
I'm reading all sorts of things. Yeah. I read. I mean, maybe Twitter is not the best place, but I read wherever I can find it.
And it doesn't agitate you?
I'm sort of fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by sort of an alternate truth at times, like things that are like, really, you really believe this? Like, there's things that I find very fascinating, but there are people where I'm not going to have a conversation with them if I don't believe that they're authentic about having a conversation. And I'm too hurt, you're right, I'm too hurt now to carry that conversation on. Before October 7th, I could have had a good sense of humor about it, but now I could never do it on certain topics or with certain people. Like, there are people who have an opposing point of view, but they'll listen. And then there are people who just, I think this is almost trained into Americans now, where they just have a list of things that they say, and they just keep going back to that list.
And what about changing your mind? Is there anything in our texts, or even did Abraham affect his father, do you think, in the understanding of that story? Did he change his outlook?
Well, his father came with him on the journey.
Now, that's often lesser known. It's like, it's Lech Lecha, but he's dad.
He starts the journey with him. Yeah, he starts
and then
the
he
journey
drops
with him.
out of the story.
So, I think changing your mind is very much a value in rabbinic Judaism. In other words, you're looking for what is true, and you're listening to questions, and sometimes you change your mind. And there are different texts like that in the Talmud of like, oh, well, this is what we thought first, and then we changed our mind with them. This is there's literally something called Mishnah Rishona. This is the first version. And then we argued about it, and we changed our mind, and this is now the new Mishnah. This is, we changed our minds.
Josh, you mentioned humility, and that does seem to have to function here, because otherwise, if you're talking about certainty, there's a certain arrogance in certainty without listening. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs said that true humility does not mean undervaluing yourself. It means valuing other people. I just love you to reflect on that in light of the fact that you brought up humility. When we were talking in our preparation, you used the word anava. How much is that actually kind of a Jewish orientation?
Well, in the book of Midot, book of moral virtues, humility is called the greatest of virtues. Of course, he said that every virtue was the greatest of virtues. But that humility allows us to see that we're small, and that the universe is great, and that we can't possibly know everything. So I think it's critical, and as Kurtzer says, that's what allows for, I like the phrase, an epistemological, epistemological humility is what he said. So truth is only arrived at through this awareness that we're small and that the universe is great. In answer to Rabbi Sachs's text, well, I think Buber sort of says the same thing, that it's not about undervaluing yourself, because as Buber said, you can't. If you undervalue yourself, the relationship's not healthy. It's about appropriately valuing the other.
And we're going to go to questions soon, but I want to touch on religious pluralism, because we've been talking more about sort of ideological pluralism. And Josh, to stay with you for a minute, as Reform Jews, I will just speak personally, pre-October 7th, even pre-protests about the judicial reforms, there was a real sense of pain, I felt, in terms of the rhetoric around Reform Jews in Israel, from the Rabbanut, from the chief rabbis, that essentially, I think we were akin to Holocaust deniers. I mean, very strong language about Reform Jews not being Jewish. And I was lucky enough to interview Chaim Steinmetz and Angela Buchdahl and Elliot Cosgrove. It was kind of groundbreaking at KJ for him to have a Reform rabbi, particularly a woman, on the bima there. If you can reflect on just even having the both of you up here, it feels like old hat, but didn't used to be. So just in a sense of where you see the kind of valuing of every voice, of every rabbinic voice, of having a sense of there being no hierarchy, pluralism as it plays out, as you see it, if you can just kind of address where you think we are, where we have to go.
You know, even in Israel, there are plenty of instances where Reform rabbis and Orthodox rabbis will sit together in certain public spaces and do things together. But sadly, the politics of the Israeli system drives a wedge, because it's a question of who has the power, who gets to be in the coalition, and if the Rabbanut, if the Orthodox are driving the coalition, then they empower the Rabbanut to say that certain laws prevent, obviously, the Reform and conservative rabbis and Reform and conservative movements from having certain rights. So it's the politics that really creates the challenge there. In New York, you know, we're blessed. We're so accustomed to be working together, and we see each other as parts of a bigger whole. That there are a lot of Jews in New York, and they all have different spiritual inclinations and communal inclinations, and so we create lots of doorways in, but we're all working together to nurture the community. So yeah, we're very fortunate here. I think that if you're able to, be able to relate to people on a one-to-one basis, you can, a lot of the political chaos that we sometimes see in Israel, you can find your way around.
Chaim, do you want to just comment on that at all?
Here, I say here. I mean, this is exactly it. I mean, the reason why I chose the text about Abraham bringing in the guests and that being so important from a spiritual perspective is exactly this. In other words, that part of the reason why politics messes everything up, and we'll get back to politics in a moment, is because we have forgotten the Tselem Elokim, the vision, the image of God in the other person. And Abraham, even though he smashes idols, in other words, there's no question about the strength of his belief, but at the same time, He knows that part of the imperative of being a true believer, like someone who has intense belief and intense faith, is that you have to have faith in the human being that's created in the image of God. So I say here, because it even starts before pluralism. Pluralism is technically a philosophical idea that there are multiple types, the multiple visions of truth. Very often there's an Indian analogy offered about the blind men who encountered the elephant, and they each come and describe it to each other. And one says it's very large, much larger than even the trunk of a tree. And the other one said, no, it's kind of like a snake. And the other one said, no, it's kind of flat and flappy. And the other one said, no, it's pointy and sharp. And they're all encountering the same elephant. They just don't get a chance to see it. So that's pluralism. But even before pluralism, it needs to be the love and respect for every human being. And if we remember that, then we'll be okay. What happens with politics, and if I can smash an idol of my own this evening, I believe politics is the idolatry of our age. Because people see this as existential. They see this as all-encompassing. There's actually an academic at the University of Pennsylvania, Michelle Margolis, who did research who said that in the last decade or so, it's not one's religious identity that will affect their political views, but vice versa. It's people's political identities that will drive them to different churches or different synagogues based on what their politics are. So if we can smash the idol of politics and remember the image of God, we will have part of the solution for the problems we have today.
And before we go to questions, I have one last one for you, Chaim. I want to just get to the idea of keeping God waiting. That it seems like in the text you chose, it's showing how paramount the welcome is. That it's like, God, can you just hold for a minute? I have guests, or I want to bring these people in. Is there any overlay, without being oversimplistic, right now that you could apply there? Like, in what way because at the same time it feels like it's because of God that we need to, or our sense of we want to be in God's eyes, that we would prioritize the guest.
Well, look, I'll go back to that Chabad Shaliach going to the encampment and putting on tefillin. In other words, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're Jews pro-Palestinian. It doesn't matter if they're Palestinian. It doesn't matter who they are. Our first obligation is to embrace, to be civil, and to offer love as much as we can. Instead of just presuming that a person is our enemy before we meet them, we need to actually look at them as someone who can be a potential friend. And so I think this idea of even God gets put aside for being a good host is something that's so critical for us to recognize we need to be good hosts as well.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. And now we will go, yes, applause. Marjorie has the mic, and I hope there will be questions. And please do ask.
If not, we're asking questions of you. Who did you vote for? I'm sorry.
Yuval Harari brings up the point that polytheistic religions tend to be more pluralistic and more acceptive of different opinions than the monotheistic religions. And I'm not talking so much about Judaism, but 1,000 years, 2,000 years of Christianity and 1,500 years of Islam and what it teaches us.
Did you all hear a question there?
Well, polytheistic religions tend to be more receptive of different points of view.
Yes.
Okay. Can I just respond to that?
Sure.
Because I actually think that's a fascinating point. So, Judaism pioneered something called ethical monotheism. We know what ethics are, and we know what monotheism is. The two of them together is what's so fascinating. Polytheism localizes a God's influence in a particular way. Polytheism isn't just about having lots of gods. It's about having different sources of authority. So the moon god has control of the moon. The sea god has control of the sea. In order to create a universal set of ethics, you need a God that commands the entirety of the universe, and one God that is above all of these other gods. So monotheism isn't just about belief in one God. It's about belief in a universal, overarching set of ethics. So your point is a good one, and so I'll just respond to that.
Chaim?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I mean, this is obviously a larger topic, but the monotheistic vision, certainly the Jewish one, is that one God creates one human being in the image of God from which all of humanity springs, which means, as the Mishnah in Sanhedrin points out, that every human being is part of the same family and every human being is a brother and sister. So I can't, in other words, the claim that polytheism leads to tolerance, I think one could make the exact opposite claim, is that certainly the Judaic monotheism leads to a very profound tolerance in which you see all of humanity as being the children of God and related to each other.
Thank you. Yes.
So you mentioned to expand the tent to have many doors of entry, which I get. My question is, by pluralism, the idea that you can, as the Burger King commercial says, have it your way, you rule, does that open the door for many exits as well?
Okay, we all want to take this question. I think you are, to some extent, pointing out one of the weaknesses. In other words, when you allow every opinion in the door, certainly in a culture like ours where everything is have it your way, then people look more to impose their will on Judaism than to look for Judaism to inform their lives. So I think that's a cogent point. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is our responsibility to make sure that what's inside the tent is compelling enough to keep people there.
Yes.
My question is, in terms of this conversation tonight, I grew up as a descendant of Holocaust survivors. Where do we draw the line if, personally speaking, we see Zionism or the State of Israel as a necessity for Jewish continuity in terms of at least educating or having conversations with those in our personal lives who may disagree with that?
Well, I think that's the question that that Abby's asked us a bunch of times now, and it is a very, very real challenge in a lot of communities, and there's a generational divide, but it's not just generational. There are people who of every generation who look at what is happening in Gaza, and they say the Israeli government is just out of its mind. And then there are people who say, well, they started it, and they get what they deserve. And, I think most people of conscience, are totally torn, and their hearts are breaking because there are truths on both sides. And they just have to figure it out. They got to figure out how it's possible to keep Israel safe, because Jewish survival depends on Israel. I believe it. And at the same time, we can't allow for others of God's children to be massacred in this way. And this is a time of broken hearts. And I don't know that there's an answer to that.
Yeah, from what you were saying, I got the impression that you said that there's a kind of a defined Jewish community with defined red lines. And to me, pluralism is that we kind of all have our own definition of what's acceptable and what's not, as opposed to having a defined community with defined red lines. And who defines those red lines?
Was that for me?
I'm good at red lines, if that's what you want to hear. So look, again, back to have it your way. A community still needs to coalesce, and a community has to have a sense of unity, even if you have that flexibility for differences of opinion. So in the Talmud, it's not like, okay, someone could walk in and say, look, I'm an advocate of Christianity, because Christianity started out as a Jewish movement. In other words, there were very clear lines. And I think that ultimately for a community to have a community has to have an identity. Well, very often the community almost does it by holistic process. In other words, it's not like me. I mean, I'd like to be in charge, but I'm not. It's holistic. It's, you know, Solomon Schechter used the term Catholic Israel, which means the totality of the Jewish people, Klal Yisrael. That there is almost a voice that begins to emerge of what we see as correct and what we don't see as correct. And then that becomes the norm.
But different Jewish communities, you know, they can draw their lines a little bit differently.
You know, you're asking actually an excellent question, is of what binds an Orthodox rabbi and a Reform rabbi together if we have very different visions of religion. And I would actually argue, not to start a new topic, is that we do have very similar visions of peoplehood, and we do have very similar visions of how we want a Jewish future to look like. So even if we have different visions of what Judaism is in practice, we do have very similar visions about what the Jewish people are.
And we also recognize that the Jewish community needs each of us. It needs each of our institutions, because the Jewish community has to have homes that are comfortable for different types of Jews. So we're part of the same project, and we answer different needs.
I just want to, maybe neither of you will answer this, but it feels like one of the new tension points is the idea of clergy not being Zionist, and whether to hire them and whether to put them in a Hillel, to put them in a synagogue. And I feel like that, what you share in common, whatever your differences might be, with most of the clergy I know, there are givens that right now feel like not so given anymore.
Well, yes. Again, it's more remote for an Orthodox rabbi. I mean, there are many anti-Zionist Orthodox Jews. They live in Williamsburg. But they're of a very, very, I mean, if I may just, do I have time to just go on a short tangent? People make a mistake, and there's about 120,000, 150,000 Satmar Hasidim, and the Satmar Hasidim follow the Satmar Rebbe, who came over from Europe, and he was a profound anti-Zionist. And people make a mistake and think, okay, those are the people who go to rally with Hamas. And they are absolutely not. That group is a small fringe group of 5,000. And what's really interesting about the Satmar Hasidim is that to them, they are in incredible grief because the Jews of Israel are in grief. In other words, they don't believe in the state of Israel. They think it's a mistake. But they are Jews who care about other Jews, and when Jews are under attack, they want to be there for them. So it's really an interesting question about, okay, well, how do you relate to younger people who are anti-Zionist, who say that they're coming forward and they want to be rabbinic leaders and they want to stand? I don't think they're qualified to lead communities. Obviously, each community, as you point out, is going to make their own decisions. I think that after the Holocaust, I think supporting the state of Israel became manifest to every Jew. And I think that that's true today. I mean, it's much more it's more remote from my experience. I don't have to ever think that I'm going to have an assistant rabbi or someone applying to be the assistant rabbi who will not be a Zionist. So I don't know what it's like in other movements.
Thank you for that answer. Josh?
So I was watching the news, I guess it was last night, and there was a report on rallies against the parade that took place so beautifully on Fifth Avenue, and the newscaster showed a picture of a group of Jews who she thought, or her producer thought, was rallying the pro-Palestinian rally, and showed the Satmar Hasidim. So, people just don't, even the producer here didn't know exactly what the photograph was all about. It was very disheartening to see that. So I was at a conference last week about the future of Reform Judaism, and there was a panel discussion on this topic about red lines in Zionism and the ordination of rabbis, and what sort of Zionist commitment should the Reform movement expect that its rabbis are willing to make. And the president of the Hebrew Union College spoke, and I think he made a very powerful argument. He said that institutions have the right to make their own choices. They have the right to set their own boundaries. As a synagogue, I want to be open to all Jews. Non-Zionist, even anti-Zionist Jews want to come to Temple Emanu-El. I am happy to have them here. Doesn't mean that the direction that I take in terms of my own thought and my own preaching about Israel is going to change. I am going to take the tack that I believe in, and presumably I will be here as long as the leadership of the congregation feels it's the tack that they want the congregation to take. But I'm welcoming of people who believe absolutely the opposite of me to be in the pews, because I think there's still something that we share in common very powerfully about our belief in Judaism. But he said that institutions can make their own choices, and agencies and synagogues, if they want to, they can decide that they're not going to hire anti-Zionist rabbis. Because if they want Judaism to be a certain type of Judaism, they have the right to hire leaders that are reflective of that ideology. But, he said, a seminary is a place of academic inquiry. And while the Hebrew Union College will always maintain its firm Zionist commitment, it wasn't going to impose a litmus test on people entering. Because to impose a litmus test on academic inquiry is to actually shut down academic inquiry. So people will come, and they will learn, and they will be challenged to become Zionists, to become supporters of Israel. And if when they are ordained, that's not where they are, well, then they may have trouble finding a job in congregations that are clearly Zionist, who have the right to ask the question. But the college, as an academic institution, was not going to impose a litmus test on people.
Really interesting. One more? Yes, in the back.
How many people, very broad, do you think really understand that Zionism was not started after the Holocaust, that it was started in the late 1800s, and that there was reasons of thousands of years for that? I think most people think Israel is some new concoction.
Okay. Zionism really starts in the 12th chapter of Genesis. Because God doesn't tell Abraham, I want you to start a religion. He says, I want you to go to this land, and I want you to start a people. And I agree with you, it is, but this is not the subject of this evening, is that a whole bunch of theory has been tossed on what is really the Jewish story and turned it into something dramatically different. But yes, to respond to it because it deserves a response, Zionism starts in the 12th chapter of Genesis.
Josh, any addition to that? Thank you both so much. You've been wonderful. And thanks to everyone. And I hope to see you in the next 3 nights.